Welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas, and I am Ken Hicks. We're moving on this week and part of next week to dealing with a new set of subjects, and that is green politics, the idea that environmentalism and ecological preservation forms a distinct ideological perspective in its own right. While in a lot of instances we look at certain ideas and say, well, that's sort of a modifier, right? We talk about, for example, nationalism as being more of a modifier than a distinct ideology in its own right. Green politics really is distinctive, in part because of its stance in criticism of the more dominant ideologies, especially in Western politics, in Western European and American politics. So what are we learning today? We're going to have an introduction, talk a little bit about what environmentalism is, what greenism is, if you will, and how it emerged. Then we're going to talk about the green critique of other ideologies, and then we're going to talk about what the difference is between an ecological ethic and why green advocates tend to speak more in terms of an ethic rather than an ideology. So green politics really begins emerging around the turn of the 20th century, and it really emerges in response to the consequences of industrialization. Remember, what happens with industrialization? There's more and more people living in larger and larger cities. There's more and more industrial activity, smokestacks and railroads and combustion engines and things like that. And that is producing ecological consequences that people begin noticing, and that a small number of people began basically saying, this may not be sustainable. And so from the green perspective, what we are confronting is a slow motion crisis. And from a green perspective, and again, like I was talking about the last couple of weeks with identity politics, I'm not asking you to agree with this 100%. And I'm not presenting this as if I am an advocate of green ideology. I'm simply laying these ideas out and giving you information of how people from an environmentalist perspective work. So from the green perspective, they look at the world in a highly interconnected way. They view the world as highly interdependent, that all these different ecological crises are caused by population growth, industrial pollution, the destruction of tropical rainforests, etc. And what we're looking at is our wholesale extinction of plants and animals that are valuable in their own right, and that when you yank out key pieces of the basic ecology, there are consequences that flow from that. And one of the consequences that the green perspective points to is the idea of the greenhouse effect. In simple terms, the greenhouse effect refers to the gradual warming of the Earth's atmosphere due to the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, CO2, which results from largely from the burning of fossil fuels such as oil, gas, coal, and etc. The additional destruction of rainforests, which are a major source of oxygen, which that helps the fact that the rainforests are producing so much oxygen through photosynthesis helps to prevent the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. And again, to a large extent, a lot of what's happening with rainforests and large forested areas is that they are helping to sequester large amounts of CO2. So Antonio Guterres, who is the UN General Secretary, basically has issued this warning. We're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator, major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. This is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current policies. And of course, Guterres has been UN Secretary General since 2016. He was elected to a second term in 2021. Prior to that, He was a Portuguese politician and diplomat. He was the socialist prime minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002. And again, the United Nations and some of the institutions within the United Nations are major kind of articulators and warners, kind of bellwethers of this climate, catastrophe that they argue is heading our way. So is this human caused? According to Green, according to environmentalists, yes, environmental crises are interconnected and they're caused by human beings. Now, there are others that argue the contrary, argue that we have, that history that archaeology suggests that we have gone through warming and heating periods due to a variety of different causes. Again, from the Green perspective, this ecological damage is resulting from, technological innovations like the creation of the combustion engine. And again, the argument is that the environmental damage stems from ideas and ideologies that place human beings above or apart from nature. And so many Greens make the argument that what they have is sort of a counter ideology. Green ideology consists of, at the heart of it, a critique of many of the key assumptions underlying the dominant ideologies, especially of liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. And so they're offering and are attempting to offer a more positive and aspirational alternative of humanity living in a more sustainably and more respectful manner vis-a-vis the natural world. In many instances, environmentalism defies left-right orientations. There are environmental perspectives along the ideological spectrum, mostly kind of in the center. Some environmentalists, like former Vice President Al Gore Jr., are clearly liberals. But there are some conservative environmentalists who follow Edmund Burke's admonition to leave the next generation a posterity, not a ruin. There are some libertarian environmentalists that believe that private ownership and market competition would be the best way to promote the environment. I believe there are some folks at the Cato Institute that make those kinds of arguments. There are a number of Christians who are increasingly advancing environmentalist positions. Some evangelical Christians believe that being conservative means caring for all God's creations. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has called on all Catholics to be good stewards of the environment. Pope Francis issued an encyclical in 2015 called Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, again, in which he argued that if you are to worship the Creator, you should care for all His creations, and again, be wise stewards of the environment. So a really central part of most Green ideologies is a critique of other ideologies. Many Greens argue that they are the only option for saving the planet, that continuing down the pathway that the dominant ideologies have led us is likely to lead to ecological ruin. There's a lot of dystopian movies and literatures about that kind of thing. So according to environmentalists, the Green perspective is humanity's forlorn hope. The selling point is that it's not just one choice among other equally good or bad choices, that the interdependence of all species produces a reality that we have to start caring for the environment. We have to do so in a sustainable way. And you can look at the tail of the tree as an example of that. Trees don't just provide utilitarian human needs like shade, fuel, and lumber. Trees are a source of oxygen, which they exchange for carbon dioxide, which again is a byproduct of burning and other processes of oxidation, including human breathing. Approximately 20 times per minute, we breathe in a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen, and we exhale CO2 with every breath. Clear-cutting tropical rainforests and destroying the huge northern forests with pollution and acid rain reduces the amount of oxygen being produced, which further increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, contributing again to the greenhouse effect, which and with it, significant climate change. It also, again, means there's less oxygen for people to take in. For those people with, kind of respiratory issues, that becomes a real serious health problem. In California, one of the reasons why they are leaders on environmental policy is that the topography of California, with mountains in the eastern part of the country and oceans to the west, has meant that a lot of pollution gets trapped above its huge cities in San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. That was producing something that they called smog, which was a combination of pollution and fog. And that was causing large numbers of people to develop really serious respiratory infections and problems, especially among children. So another issue is that global warming contributes to drought conditions, transforming previously arable farmland into deserts and dust bowls, which reduces crop production, meaning that the likelihood of human famine and animal starvation greatly increases. Global warming also contributes to the melting snow caps, which contributes to rising sea levels and the increased temperature of the world's oceans, given that the oceans themselves act as a kind of heat sink, which cools the Earth's temperatures. Rising temperatures, again, contribute to much more intense storm activity and flood events, exposing vulnerable coastal cities like New Orleans, which is actually below sea level, and Karachi, Pakistan, to devastating flooding from these large oceanographic events. So according to Greens, what goes around comes around. All the world's major religions have cautionary tales about arrogance and the downfall of communities when they don't plan ahead. The interconnectedness of living things is an essential element, for example, of Buddhism. All the Abrahamic faiths, which include, of course, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity as the prominent ones, embrace these kinds of themes, one of which you can see in Galatians 6:7, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. That's for we Episcopalians, we would say, as ye reap, so shall ye sow. All actions can have significant and lasting effects. Especially those actions that involve consuming, resources that can't necessarily be easily renewed. And so Greens are basically declaring kind of a pox on all other ideologies. From the Green perspective, there's a criticism of specific beliefs and unexamined assumptions, especially of liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. Greens particularly criticize the major ideologies' attitudes towards nature. And the tendency is for, particularly from the liberal and socialist perspective, to celebrate humanity's use of technology to conquer or master nature. From the Green perspective, that promotes a kind of arrogant notions of anthropocentrism, of human-centric views of looking at the world that's short-sighted and dangerous. And so, particularly from most of these ideologies' perspectives, the measure of progress is technological, scientific, and economic progress in terms of species power, in terms of humanity's ability to, remove itself from exposure to nature and to conquer nature. Sir Francis Bacon was a great early Enlightenment philosopher and scientist, described nature in feminine terms as haughty and proud, that must be subdued. John Locke likewise believed that nature by itself was without value. The liberal conviction sprung from that idea that only through improvement by labor, by clearing woods, by building buildings, by damming rivers, otherwise unimproved nature is, for the liberal perspective, mere waste. Marxism has a similar kind of attitude, where again, Marx was not necessarily critical of capitalism's exploitation of nature. In fact, if you recall from our discussion of socialism, he celebrated. He argued that that was one of the great progressive aspects of capitalism in its early stages, that it in a dramatic, just a span of a few generations, dramatically increased the productivity, the human capacity to build and to make things and to feed populations. So he actually envisioned socialism as the inheritor of capitalism's productive capacity. Keep in mind, for Marx, the whole idea of socialism was that you would have the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the proletariat wouldn't be destroying capitalism. They would be using those productive capacities in a more democratic way and distributing this productivity in a more equitable manner. And so, Marx and most socialists believe that control over nature was critical for these stages of history to produce the dictatorship of the proletariat and to ultimately create a socialist and then ultimately a communist society. Libertarians are, similarly, kind of have the attitude that nature is there to be, to be exploited. Ayn Rand, who was sort of a foundational libertarian figure, this is a picture of her. She's got one of these lapel pins of a dollar sign and a cigarette in her hand. She was, kind of the quintessential libertarian capitalist. Her book, The Fountainhead, which was published in 1943, had a character named Howard Roark. He looked at a pristine mountain lake, and what he saw was everything that was the materials that he could build, right? The granite could be cut for walls. The trees could be split for lumber. Everything was about taking and building. And so, Howard Roark really kind of is a perfect exemplification of this idea of anthropocentrism. Which again, according to green ideology, is the human-centric viewpoint that leads to selfish and narrow perspectives in relation to the environment. So the significance of anthropocentrism is that it fails to grasp the inherently interdependent relationship that humanity has with nature, and that can be harmful to humanity in the long term. And so again, from the green perspective, all other ideologies are effectively just polluters. And this is a picture of Chernobyl. And basically the environmental argument is that liberals are no better. Liberals almost destroyed a good portion of the eastern seaboard with the 3 Mile Island accident. With nuclear power especially, those ideologies care more about the production of energy than about how to deal with the really dangerous aspects of nuclear energy, one of which is it produces byproducts in terms of in the form of nuclear waste that we really don't know how to deal with. We basically just bury it. And so both systems have seen massive ecological degradation for ideological reasons. And Greens see little difference between capitalism and communism. They're both polluters. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be moving in the direction of an ecological ethic. This is an argument for an ethic rather than an ideology. Again, the key elements of an environmental ethic is this emphasis on the interconnections and mutual dependence within which all living beings live. Second part of this is the idea of respect for all life. Even mosquitoes are serving a role. Even predators serve an important role within, an ecology. And so the fate of the earth these days, according to Greens, is, that the earth is dependent on humanity, for better or worse. We've entered a period that geologists and climatologists call the Anthropocene, which is, again, the human era. So Greens argue in favor of stewardship. And what exactly is stewardship? It basically means that you are in the care of something. This emerges out of the medieval period where you would have a steward who would be looking after the country while a monarch who may only be an infant is growing into maturity. And so it's again the idea that you are caring for something that's not necessarily yours. Greens advocate the stewardship of the earth. You have the duty to look after the health and well-being of future generations. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why most environmentalists are really hostile to nuclear power plants. And it's one of the reasons, why the advocacy of nuclear power is coming back into relevance, and we are kind of relitigating this argument, is that big tech, Silicon Valley, knows full well that they need more reliable sources of power in order to build these huge AI plants and these energy, solar energy plants that they're creating. That's going to be an enormous energy suck, and they know it, and they want to go back to doing nuclear power. Environmentalists question, that there is such a thing as cheap energy. They basically look, for example, at fossil fuels, and everybody says, well, that's a cheap way to power your cars, heat your homes, and so on. But Greens, basically point out that these are finite. These resources are not necessarily renewable. Wendell Berry criticizes the idea that fossil fuel energy is cheap. The basis of such claims are based on an entitlement that the present generation has some unique claim on these resources. And Berry argues that this sense of entitlement is based on the idea that might makes right. However, since such resources are, again, limited in quantity and not renewable, Berry contends that fossil fuels do not belong to one generation more than another. Berry writes, "We ignored the claims of posterity simply because we could, the living being stronger than the unborn, and so worked the miracle of industrial progress by the theft of energy from, among others, our children." And so the essence of this critique is that the willingness to monetize and use in our own time the birthright and livelihood of posterity is short-sighted, and we will reap the whirlwind at some later date. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but we are potentially condemning our future to a much less bright set of possibilities. What's important for the green perspective is the idea of time horizons and the challenges confronting collective action. So a horizon marks the limit of vision, right? Vision, you can't line of sight, you can't bend vision, you can't see around corners. Likewise, you can only see into the distance as far as your vision will carry you. And the curve of the earth creates this phenomenon called line of sight, which means you can't see past a certain point in time. The time horizon, in contrast, marks the limits on how far into the future communities of people can plan. And there is this challenge that we would call discounting. On the one hand, if someone offers you, says, look, I'll give you $20 today, or I'll give you $20 tomorrow. You would almost certainly take the $20 immediately because you have no incentive to defer gratification. But if you're offered $20 today, but $22 the next day, then that's going to that's going to affect your calculations at least a little bit. Because some people would say, well, I might die between now and then, and what good is that $2? But imagine you're offered $20 today or $200 a year from now. Most people would really have to give it some thought because, again, the more distant the benefit, the harder it is to calculate its worth. And so the difficulty with time horizons for green, for environmentalists, is that when Greens ask people to cut back on driving or air travel to reduce CO2, they're really asking people to adopt a time horizon that extends pretty far into the future without any real direct benefit to themselves personally. And that produces what we would call a collective action problem, which another way of looking at that is what we call the free rider problem. And those are, again, the calculated costs of collective actions versus the benefits of defection, right? So most human beings are what we might call mini-maxers. They try to get the maximum they can from the minimum of effort. And so whenever there is some collective action, being contemplated, the challenge is that a person might calculate, I can do what I'm doing, I can refuse to participate, but nevertheless the collective action works. And in that instance, I have won without taking any effective effort. That is sort of the essence of the free rider problem. And so the challenge here is when you're talking about private goods, that's one thing, because that's something that you can actually, see where, if I'm making a private action or if I'm pursuing a private good, I have a goal in mind. With public goods, they're distributed widely, and that produces, again, a challenge of how do I know where, how do I benefit from cleaner air? In theory, I know that cleaner air is better for me. But it may be that, again, the actions that I'm being asked to undertake are sufficiently onerous that it really does produce a challenge in terms of how I'm going to pursue it or whether I'm going to pursue it. And when you're talking about ecological and environmental conservation, you are inevitably talking about public goods. And so all public goods require collective action. Individuals oftentimes will have few incentives to collaborate. And so if one person's contributions create a burden but makes little difference to the ultimate success of the endeavor, then that's a really difficult collective action problem, right? I'm reminded of a situation in the 1930s. There was a really bad tsunami that hit. It might have even been earlier than that. It might have been like in the early around the turn of the 20th century. There's a really bad tsunami that hit a part of Japan's coastline. And this one Japanese guy who ultimately became the mayor of the town that he was at was basically making the argument for decades, we need to build a seawall. We don't want to get hit by another tsunami. And everybody was like, that was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Why are we going to do this? And he just kept working at it. And he kept, building coalitions. It would fall apart. He'd keep working at it. And eventually he persuaded the town at great expense to build a seawall. And when the tsunami that hit this Fukushima, nuclear power plant came ashore, that town was basically saved from significant flooding by that seawall. And people were like, this was like a Jonah and the Ark kind of story in modernity. This was an example of, somebody who had a vision that just became monomaniacally, directed towards doing this thing that he believed would help the community in the long run. And he eventually persuaded the community, some of whom probably were just like, well, let's just humor this guy. Maybe we'll get some jobs out of it. Maybe, but at the end of the day, it was a prudent decision that protected an entire community. And so let's talk a little bit about the idea. One of the central kind of ideas behind environmentalism and green ideology is this idea of sustainability. And this is a brief excerpt from a book by Leslie Paul Thiele, who's a distinguished professor of political science at the University of Florida. Again, one of his more recent books in 2024 is Sustainability, the title of it. And it explores the environmental responsibilities that are inherent in the idea of citizenship. And so he talks about a hike he took with his sons up in a wooded coastal area in Canada, I believe. And he said that the hike along this beautiful, pristine, lakefront, oceanfront area was really provided him with an enormous amount of inspiration. And it was a demonstration that the natural world is more than simply a resources. Trees are not just for cutting. They provide an important aesthetic and spiritual benefit, that being in nature, some people just see it as, I'm just in another place. But some people are moved by it. It provides inspiration. It provides sustenance for their spiritual life. It can be a recharging, galvanizing. It can provide people with energy. And fire their imagination of what future possibilities could be by hunting and hiking and doing things like that. And so sustainability is a relatively recent entry into kind of common parlance. Sustainability, along with democracy and human rights, is one of the few ideals that has gained almost near universal endorsement. But there is a question about what sustainability involves. And when you look at this slide here, there's this challenge, right? You have environmental preservation, you have social, preserving the social fabric of communities, and then you have the economy, which is again designed to provide for people's well-being, to make sure that they have sufficient resources to live, food, shelter, things like that. And sustainability, this is kind of a Venn diagram that explores the three boxes of sustainability, where you're trying to, synthesize these three separate dimensions of human, society. So again, first the question is, what is sustainability not? Clearly, practices that undermine the conditions, productive practices that undermine the conditions of its own viability are an example of unsustainable practices. And so it's not sustainable to draw more water from the aquifers deep underneath the soil than natural recharge from rain or snow allows. That is not a sustainable practice. That's a challenge that you have, for example, in California, where there are water-intensive agricultural farms that grow, for example, almonds. Almond trees are they drink enormous amounts of water. And so they have to suck huge amounts of water out of the aquifers to mass produce almonds for sale. That everybody loves. I love almonds, they're great. But they come at a high cost in terms of environmental production when you are producing almonds on an industrial scale. Likewise, intensive agriculture that doesn't allow topsoil to naturally regenerate is not sustainable. We had a demonstration of that in the early 20th century here in this part of the world, where repeatedly growing the same crops over and over again eroded the soil to such an extent that you had something known as the Dust Bowl, where you had horrific dust storms and desertification of previously really fertile farmland that really damaged communities. You had a huge out-migration here in Oklahoma and other Midwestern states to California because of the Dust Bowl, because people they went bankrupt. They couldn't continue their farming practices because they had over-farmed through intensive agriculture. And that also contributed to the Great Depression, because overproduction of agricultural products led to inflation, where farmers increasingly were not able to get an adequate return because there was a glut on the market of wheat and other things, wheat and corn and other crops that they were growing. So they weren't getting enough of a return to put crops back into the ground. And the fact that food was so cheap initially, it also contributed ultimately to inflation. The popular saying, again, the challenge of meeting current needs without undermining future well-being. The popular saying is, we have inherited the earth not from our parents, we have borrowed it from our children. So if current trends, continue, again, we're going to result in a much hotter and more disruptive climate, rising and more acidic oceans, greatly diminished biodiversity, and crucial natural resources such as fresh water and arable land will be in dangerously short supply. That will have political consequences because, again, access to fresh water has led to wars in the past, and it could easily lead to wars in the future. So sustainability expands our moral time horizons, making the reversal of these alarming trends an obligation. We don't have, really the luxury of pretending that we don't need to act. Thiele talks about, the fact that conservation has ancient roots. Prior to the development of agriculture, hunter-gatherer bands, were compelled to move frequently simply because they gathered all the edible food, or they hunted all the edible animals in a particular area, and so they were compelled to frequently move from one spot to the next, and so they had to avoid the overuse of an area's resources, and that produced within human communities a primordial imperative: waste not, want not. And so in the ancient world, it was essential for your survival to recognize when you needed to uproot and move to another area where the hunting and the gathering would be more productive. And the failure to do so produced very high prices in terms of famine and losing members of your community. And it's important to remember, in the ancient world, that was a pathway to extinction of your group if you were losing people because you couldn't afford to feed them. Still in the ancient world, even before recorded history, people began living in agricultural, in farmland. They began, farming to produce goods. And that's an important development in human civilization and moving in the direction of human civilization. It's one of the reasons why you end up seeing the emergence of political authority. And one of the first things that political authorities do is begin creating things like writing and mathematics so that they know how much food is being produced. Because the whole point of agriculture is to produce more than you need for future needs, right? So you have to be able to store grain. You have to know how to store grain in such a way that it doesn't mold and become inedible. You have to look after that stuff. You have to protect it to prevent people who are not good at planning ahead from robbing one another. This is sort of the origin point of political order, that someone has to be in charge of managing the storage and the keeping of food, and that's one of the reasons why we began creating a political class. You have to say these people are rewarded so that they don't face the possibility of famine and join the mob in breaking in and stealing things. So, agricultural societies had to develop plans for sustainability, and the prime directive of ancient agriculture is don't eat your seed, right? Don't eat the stuff that you're going to have to plant with. And so if you're satisfying today's needs without regard to the future, again, that is a recipe for famine, and it's even more dangerous because, agricultural communities where you're farming communities are far less mobile than pastoral communities that follow herds of animals or that keep herds of cows or whatever. Even again, in the ancient world that we know of, sustainability applied to more than simple food security. Among the ancient Greeks, the Athenians, young Athenians attended what was known as the Ephebic College, and they took the Ephebic Oath, which included, the pledge to honor the laws and to foster virtue, but again, also included, thus in all these ways we will transmit this city, not only not less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. And this reflects again what Burke argued, and it reflects that idea, the wisdom of ancient humans, that we should try to leave places better than we found them. And that is an important aspect of how we look at environmentalism. Among the Romans, you have the emergence of this argument of prudence. And again, what is prudence? It is the idea of precaution. It is the idea that we look to the past and that we try and make sure that we make, kind of middling decisions that don't expose us to risk, but that do the most to secure our future. And this is based in, or certainly illustrated in the writings and the speeches of Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was considered to be one of the most eloquent of the Roman Republic's statesmen. He argues again, prudence requires building on past experience while exploiting present opportunities to ensure future welfare. And again, his dictum, precaution is better than cure, is reflected again in our modern ideas that a penny of preparation is worth a pound of cure. Similarly, you had the Iroquois, the great law of peace. A lot of people make the argument that Native Americans provided a powerful, illustration of how democracy could work. And a lot of, American colonial communities adopted some of the practices of the Iroquois, which they formed a confederation in the 12th century A.D. And it lasted for more than 500 years. These were the indigenous peoples of eastern Canada and the United States. And the law required that leaders look and listen for the welfare of the whole people, and have always in view not only the present but also the coming generations, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation. Again, this reflects an important idea within environmentalism, that we're not simply trying to preserve the environment for today, but rather we want the people that come after us to have as good as or better environment to come into, to live within. Thiele looks at the idea of conservation and points to early movement towards a conservationist view. And this really, again, emerges around the turn of the 20th century. And again, what is happening? We've had about a generation of industry take place. Again, the railroads, the widespread use of coal, the buildings of huge cities with, the beginnings of skyscrapers, with huge, massive use of coal, and increasingly we're beginning to see, the emergence of things like the combustion engine. And there is a small group of people who are looking at these things and saying, eek, this is dangerous. And one of the first of those people was a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who was he was an American forester. He was one of the early directors of the forestry division in the Department of Agriculture. He later served as governor of Pennsylvania as well. He was born in 1865, lived until 1946. And Gifford Pinchot was a fascinating guy, not simply in understanding how the forestry worked, but also just in understanding how bureaucracy worked. And Pinchot understood that if he was going to change, if he was going to defend the idea of preserving the wilderness, and remember that trees were being cut down at massive rates for paper, for housing, for all kinds of stuff, for fuel. And he looked at that with some alarm, and he understood that as head of the forestry division, he had a job to do, not simply to protect the forest, not simply to hire people and manage the personnel that were going out into the forest and preserving that forest land, but also in raising people's awareness. He was one of the first people in the federal bureaucracy to hire publicists to advance the goals and the mission, and to basically explain to Americans why forestry was really important. And so the central aim for which conservation stands is to make this country the best possible place to live in, both for us and our descendants. And this future concern is always present. And so that means a commitment to equality of opportunity for every American to get his fair share of benefit from these resources, both now and hereafter. And again, that reflects this idea that environmentalists are very, very future-oriented. Another important environmentalist is John Muir, who again lived from 1838 to 1914. He was a Scottish-born American naturalist who basically challenged Gifford Pinchot's idea of conservation. And again, what was Gifford Pinchot saying? He was saying, let's not cut all the trees down in one area. Let's cut trees down, let's thin areas out. Let's not just do it on an industrial scale. Let's preserve the woodlands. Muir was basically saying not only do we need to conserve, we also need to preserve the wilderness. And Muir was one of the co-founders of the Sierra Club, which again was, is an environmental interest group that is, again, dedicated to the preservation of wilderness areas. Again, it's a challenge to this liberal notion that nature is a wasteland. And so Muir, again, advances also the argument that human beings are a part of nature, that we benefit from seeing ourselves as connected to nature. And so, his point was, when you try to pick out anything by itself, you find it is hitched to everything else in the universe. And that sort of sense of interdependence really is again driving these arguments. And so another important guy that you learn about from Leslie Paul Thiele is Aldo Leopold, who was again a very important ecologist and environmentalist. Leopold worked for Gifford Pinchot in the forestry division. He also became an academic. He worked at the University of Wisconsin. He talked about the idea of Thiele talked about the idea of predator extermination programs in the early 20th century. Remember, in the early 20th century is when Americans began expanding ranching into areas where you have large populations of wolves, bears, grizzly bears, and other kinds of dangerous predators. And ranchers became more and more politically influential in these western states where the forestry division was largely located. And so as ranching became more developed and expanded into these wilderness areas, predation of livestock became a government concern, because ranching interests were going to the government to demand that something be done to control this predation, because every cow that gets taken by a bear or a group of wolves is one less cow or steer or bull that can be sold in the marketplace. And so the preferred policy of the ranchers was for the government to aggressively engage in programs. Again, this is government spending, right? To eliminate these predators. And Leopold was one of the forestry people that was actually involved in wolf hunting. And he actually told the story of wounding a wolf and pursuing it. It was able to run away, and pursuing it until he found it, bleeding out and dying. And he looked at it as it kind of expired, and he had an epiphany from that moment, that looking at how fiercely alive that animal was that he had just that he was in the act of killing, inspired in him an abhorrence of just the wanton and needless killing. And so, he began thinking of ways of understanding what was happening. And one of the first things he began noticing, as they began, killing off virtually all the wolves in the lower 48, was that deer began overpopulating because there was no natural predation. They could breed as much as they wanted, and the result was that you had huge deer populations that were basically destroying the forests. They were eating everything, and so that was producing overgrazing. It was killing trees. It was killing underground brush. It was damaging the ecology. From that, Leopold began recognizing that these kinds of programs were environmentally unsound. Okay, a year following his death, Leopold died of a heart attack. He was responding to a neighboring farmer. He was a farmer as well in a county in Wisconsin. And there was a brush fire, and he was trying to help put out the brush fire, and he suffered a heart attack and died suddenly. But he had already written what would become a classic of environmentalism within the environmentalist canon of literature, which is the Sand County Almanac. And he in that book, or in that almanac, he talks about the idea of a land ethic, and he calls to shift humanity's relationship with the natural world. He talks about the idea of moving from conqueror of nature to plain member and citizen of a landed community. And his principle was, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And that again includes the whole ecology of an area. And he said it's wrong when it tends otherwise, when it tends to destroy, when it tends to reduce the population. He's basically saying that according to the land ethic, this is wrong. And one of the reasons why this is, the Sand County Almanac is so resonant within the community is one of the reasons why they say green is not an ideology, it is an ethic. It is a way of correct behavior vis-a-vis the environment. Another admonition of Leopold is to think like a mountain. And that involves, again, to consider both the intended and the unintended consequences. And this is something that humans don't often do particularly well. That on the one hand, we oftentimes will say, yes, we want to do this or that, this or that program because it will protect the rancher's, investment in cattle, or it will, for example, in the South they introduced kudzu, which is an Asian plant that very quickly took over many parts of the Southeast because it again there was nothing that ate it. In nature, there was nothing there were no biomes that would keep it in check, and so it ran rampant. And so it's an important recognition that every action has both the effects that you're looking for, but then you also have to check for the byproducts and the unintended consequences. And so the first law of human ecology is that we can never do merely one thing. I think this is actually valuable to understand generally in any ideology. Every action, every human action you're going to take is likely to have unintended consequences. And you should be thinking about those unintended consequences when you take an action. And so for every action you ask, and then what? Then what is likely to happen? Then keep an eye out for the things that we can't conceive of, but that nevertheless may spin out from the actions that we have taken. And so Thiele talks about the importance of ecological resilience, economic welfare, and social equity, and cultural creativity. These are all components of an environmental ethic towards sustainability. Okay, on the one hand, you have to recognize, yes, ecologies are resilient. At the same time, you have to recognize that economic welfare is an important first thing that you have to account for. Because if people are going to be harmed by an ecological or environmental policy, they're going to be resistant to it. You have to find ways, you have to find creative ways of helping people improve their circumstances by the environmental policies you want to preserve. So sustainable practices have to do more than simply preserving nature. Environmental protection stands or falls based on meeting the economic and social needs of local and global communities. There's a really interesting book by James C. Scott called Seeing Like a State, which I think I may have mentioned in an earlier presentation, where again, you're talking about the Germans. They wanted to build ships for their navy. They wanted to produce Norway spruce, which was considered one of the straightest trees and one of the easiest ones to actually grow quickly. The problem was they were destroying the entire ecology of the parts of Germany where they were planting the trees, because again, Norway spruce was a foreign kind of fauna, or flora, I should say, and it was destroying certain kinds of herbs that that many villagers relied on, and it was for the broad scale advantage it produces knocked-on effects that were very harmful for the communities in the long run. Okay? And so starving people can't afford to be environmentalists. So to care about the environment, this is something that Richard Leakey, who was a Kenyan paleoanthropologist who studies provided evidence in the early 20th century for the theory that humanity originated in Africa. And so he would say to care about the environment requires at least 1 square meal a day. And so the point is that you have to make those communities that you're asking to preserve the environment, you have to make it so that those communities are benefiting and that they are not, sacrificing their food security on the altar of environmental protection. So poverty is not the only obstacle to conservation. If you think about some of our other when you think about indigenous liberation that we talked about last week, you have politically powerful people, in the Philippines and in Brazil, Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, that were basically in the pockets of big industrialists who wanted to clear cut the forests, for a variety of different reasons. And so, the pursuit of wealth in many ways contributes far more to the overdepletion of the world's natural resources than anything that's being done by indigenous farmers in the Amazon or in those areas. And so it's important to recognize that organization matters. How society is organized greatly affects the state of the environment. And so when you think about the 3 pillars of sustainability, society, people, and planet, society must balance social welfare, environmental protection, and economic viability. Again, the point of sustainability is not austerity. You have to be prepared to make sure that people's opportunities within their economic prospects are not harmed by sustainable practices. Otherwise, again, you are producing opponents to those environmental practices. So sustainability requires better integration of the pursuit of ecological resilience, economic welfare, social equity, and cultural creativity. And so sustainability can't mean that you're just taking away from people and saying, you can't go into the woods and harvest these plants because we're trying to preserve them. Lester Brown makes the argument, he's another environmentalist, sustainability cannot be accomplished by individuals engaged in lifestyle choices. So it may be a micro virtue of yours to try to recycle all your plastics. In the long run, those individual efforts are important, but they're not going to be determinative. Okay? Sustainability requires collective action. Sustainability, to live sustainably, we must act not only as conscientious consumers, but as engaged citizens. And this is one of the arguments that most environmentalists say, and that they're going to make the argument that real environmentalists, true environmentalists, are also Democrats. They believe in citizenship. They believe in collective action. You don't see many instances where authoritarian governments suddenly morph into environmentally conscious actors. Because one thing you can learn out of this class is that most authoritarian societies are also corrupt societies. That when you see a society moving in in an authoritarian direction, there is corruption that is driving that move. So an important aspect of this is the idea of resilience, right? Resilience is basically this idea of adaptability, right? Biotic communities, and remember, what is a biotic community? It is that collection of, water, plants, and animals that are, kind of native to an area. Biotic communities are most resilient when they have an opportunity to adapt. When some new thing is introduced to them that creates a challenge, if it's relatively small scale, it's typically going to be a manageable challenge. So when the speed and the scale of change is manageable, successful adaptation is more likely. When the speed and scale of change is excessive, then that's when that's when biotic communities are strained, and when they may ultimately, key elements of it may collapse because they lack the capacity of changing sufficiently. Thiele notes that over the planet's 4.5 billion years, scientists have identified 5 distinct extinction events where large-scale extinctions have occurred. One of them, being, when you had the meteor that hit during one of the ages of the dinosaurs that basically produced something like a nuclear winter. It happened very rapidly, and you had by that time, fauna, animals that were very well adapted to a very hot environment. There were some dinosaurs that had adapted to more temperate climes, but for the most part, the dinosaurs were very well adapted to dealing with heat. So it was a very sudden change. And it was a very dramatic change, and it ultimately led to a profound extinction event where you had dinosaurs as an entire class of animals basically die off. And it took a very resilient mammalian, set of mammalian species to actually survive that event and be able to, manage the resulting, rapid change in climate that basically enabled life to continue. From the green perspective, our current challenge is human-made. This is Thiele's argument. Sustainability might best be defined as managing the speed and the scale of change in order to preserve core values and relationships. There is a need for experimentation, but it needs to be cautious. Again, prudent experimentation enables you to try things on a small scale and figure out what works and what doesn't, so that you don't work out things in ways that actually are harmful to the environment overall. And the green perspective reflects something important that Henry David Thoreau wrote about quite a bit. In wilderness is the preservation of the world. And that is, again, this sense in which nature regenerates things. That if you allow nature the opportunity, it can fix a lot of humanity's problems. Overpopulation, all this other stuff. If you put a restraining hand on humanity's, exuberance and enthusiasm for doing big things, then you give nature that opportunity to take back over and to bring things back into balance. And so Thiele concludes by, talking about the idea of technology being a savior of the environment and being a guide to the future of sustainability. And he describes them somewhat dismissively as the prophets of ecological modernism. And the modernists believe that you balance environmentalism with other things like the advocacy of nuclear power, genetically modified crops, and geoengineering. Modernists advocate these positions to give nature room rather than engaging in the conquest of nature. And so, ecological modernists are environmentalists of a sort. Most of the other environmentalists don't really, they're more highly critical of them. Again, because they want to do things like do nuclear. And again, I spoke of, why, for example, people in Silicon Valley want to go back to nuclear. But again, the problem with nuclear power is what? You have to have access to enormous amounts of water because you have to be able to cool nuclear power plants. And you have to find a way to reliably and safely dispose of the inevitable nuclear waste. And simply injecting it underground or storing it in caves is not a particularly effective view from the environmentalist perspective. And again, also, a lot of people have said, well, what's the best way to build a nuclear power? Well, the Japanese built Fukushima near the ocean. Plentiful water, right? But that is also an area where there is a lot of volatility. There are more earthquakes in these areas. And so you have to find ways of really doing it right. And if you don't get it right, nuclear reactor breakdowns are horrific in terms of the environmental consequences. If you want to study what happened around Fukushima to the environment, or what happened around Chernobyl, which is one of the worst nuclear reactor disasters of the modern age, then you get two understandings when you look at Chernobyl. Once again, you look at how horrific that kind of human-made disaster can be, and then you also get to look at how incredibly resilient nature can be. So when you think about, for example, geoengineering, one of the ideas is to reduce solar radiation by introducing sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. That would have the effect of reflecting radiation away from the Earth. But what happens if you don't get it right? What happens if you reflect too much radiation away from the Earth? Does that produce cooling beyond what you may be hoping for? How do you manage the amount of sulfur dioxide to control for that? It may solve the immediate problem, but it does nothing to slow down the production of greenhouse gases or the acidification of the oceans. And so from the environmentalist, from the more environmentally purist perspective, geoengineering projects like sulfur dioxide seeding is like fighting obesity by strapping a corset around you and continuing to eat a diet primarily of donuts. And so it's sort of a common argument among environmentalists. The technology is not going to save us. Doug Tompkins, who is pictured on this slide, was the founder of North Face, which is an outdoor clothing company that was created. The idea behind it was to outfit mountain climbers, but they didn't reckon with just how popular that clothing would be. Tompkins is a strong advocate, or was a strong advocate of ecological conservation, and he helped fund numerous large-scale projects in Chile and Argentina. He basically made made the argument that technology is not going to save us. It actually enslaves us, and it destroys the earth in the process. Think about all the stuff that your cell phone requires these days. Think about the rare earths that is required to produce these screens that are touch screen sensitive. Think about the mining that takes place, and the ecological consequences of that. And he's talking about the techno-industrial culture that is packed with unsustainable practices. And so you have to ask yourself the next time you go to buy a cell phone, which I recently did, and to my chagrin, I don't really know how to turn it off or anything like that. Yeah, ask yourself, and then what? And then what? What are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences of the fact that we have a cell phone industry or a tech industry that expects you to buy a new cell phone or a new laptop every couple of years, that is designing these things to become obsolescent, within a 2 to 5 year time frame? What next? What are the consequences? How are we recycling these things? That's what we have to be aware of, according to the environmentalist perspective. That's all I'm going to do for today. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of the green ideology. I'll see you next time.